Alright, welcome back to a brand new NestJS tutorial. In this tutorial, you're going to learn everything that you'll need to know to get a simple NestJS project working with MySQL and TypeORM. So this will be a very in-depth crash course. We'll cover everything such as reading from the database, creating items in a database, or I should say records in the database, updating records, deleting records. You'll learn about one-to-many, many-to-one relationships. You'll learn about one-to-one relationships. With TypeORM, I'll show you everything that you'll need to know to actually build incredible CRUD applications. You'll also learn about how to use the repository API with TypeORM. That's a very important fundamental concept that everyone needs to know that wants to use TypeORM. So you'll learn about that as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's just first create our project. So I'll call it NestJS MySQL or NestJS TypeORM MySQL tutorial. And then we're just going to generate this project. Alright, so our project has finished installing. So now let's just cd into that directory. So cd NestJS TypeORM MySQL tutorial. And I'm going to go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code. Okay. And then we'll have all of our generated files, which is okay. We'll create a new module later on. But what we're going to do is we're going to install the necessary packages. So before we even continue, make sure you have MySQL Server installed. Otherwise, you won't be able to actually continue with this video. So I'm assuming that you all already have MySQL installed. That is the MySQL Server, right? You need to make sure you have that installed, have it running in order for your code to actually connect to the database. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So there's plenty of videos on YouTube. There's plenty of guides on Google on how to install MySQL Server. So just go ahead and find one that fits your case. I do have a video on my channel. You can go ahead and look that up. I'll leave a link in the description as well if you need it. And yeah, also I would also recommend making sure that you have the MySQL CLI tool installed as well. So that will also help a lot. But you could also use MySQL Workbench. But in this video, I'll be using the MySQL command line. Anyways, so we're going to need to install a couple packages. So inside my terminal, I'm going to go ahead and type yarn add, and then the three packages. So at nestjs / TypeORM. So this is the TypeORM package. Well, it's the wrapper for NestJS. Then we want to install the actual TypeORM package. And then we want to install MySQL 2. Now, there's actually, I think this is all we'll need. So we don't need to install anything else. So let's install that. Okay, so that should be almost done in just a second. Perfect. It's almost done. Okay, so now that we've installed our packages, what we're going to do is we're going to connect to our database. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll go inside app.module.ts or app.module.ts. That's the root module. I'll leave alone the app controller and the app service. I don't really care about those files right now. But I do want to import the TypeORM module, which comes from the @nestjs TypeORM package. So let me zoom in a little bit. So you can see that this import comes from @nestjs / TypeORM. And then we're going to go ahead and call for root. And then we want to pass in options. So these options are basically going to consist of our database credentials, okay, as well as other TypeORM specific configurations. So the first thing that we'll set is the type. So the type will be MySQL because obviously we're using MySQL as a database. Okay. The next thing is going to be the host. So I'm using localhost. So I'm going to type localhost. But of course, if you have a managed database that lives on the cloud, you can also use that as well. Or if you have a MySQL server that lives on some other computer and the domain or IP address, you can use that as well. The port is going to be 3306. That's the default port for MySQL. But make sure if you have configured the port to a different port when you installed MySQL, make sure you provide that port. For username, I'm going to provide my username, so that is going to be test user. Password will be my password, testuser123. Okay. And for the database, we're going to need to create this database, which I'll show you how to do that. So I'm going to call this NestJS SQL tutorial, or MySQL tutorial. Okay, and then entities. So this is going to be an array. Later on, when we create entities in TypeORM in our code, you'll understand what this is for. But for now, just leave it like that. And finally, we'll set the synchronize property to true. And basically what synchronize will do is every single time we modify our entities, it's going to go ahead and basically auto update the tables. It'll auto create any new tables that is needed. If you were to update like a field in your entity, it would also update that in the table as the column as well. You'll see how everything works when I open up the MySQL CLI. Okay, but this is pretty much it for configuring TypeORM. Let's go ahead and run our application. Okay, yarn start dev, and we're going to get an error. Just watch. Yep, it says unknown database, NestJS, MySQL, and that's fine. Let me exit. So we need to actually create the database. So I'm going to go into my PowerShell, and I'm going to go ahead and log into MySQL. So I'm going to use the PowerShell. If you want to use MySQL Workbench, you can do that. But I'm just going to type MySQL-u. So that's going to be my username, -p for password. And I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to prompt me for my password. So I'm just going to type the same password that I provided in the TypeORM configuration, which is testuser123. And then we're in. And then I'm going to go ahead and create the database with the same exact name, NestJS _ MySQL _ tutorial. So I'm going to type create database, paste that in, semicolon, hit enter, and it's going to say query OK, which means that we created a database. In order to actually step into the database and actually query its tables, we have to use it. So we have to type use NestJS MySQL tutorial, and that's the name of the database. And if I type show tables, it's going to give me an empty set because we don't have any tables, but that's fine. Let's just rerun our application now, and let's just make sure that there's no errors. And there shouldn't be, because it should be able to connect to that database now that it has existed. Perfect. All right, so now that we have our database created, our application is up and running, it's able to connect to TypeORM. Let's actually go ahead and create a TypeORM entity. So let's create a new folder called TypeORM, and I'll create a new folder called entities, and this is where all of our entities will live. Now, before we create an entity, let's talk about what exactly a TypeORM entity is. Okay, because that's something that you definitely need to make sure you are aware of. So basically, think of it like this, right? We're using MySQL. MySQL is a database that consists of tables and columns, right? Well, TypeORM is an ORM, which stands for Object Relational Mapper. Okay, if you're not familiar with that, I would highly recommend you read up on ORMs because they're very powerful tools. But basically, the whole point of an ORM is to take, typically it takes, things like JavaScript classes or TypeScript classes, right? It depends on what language you use, but in our case, we're using TypeScript, right? It'll take that TypeScript class, and then what it'll do is it'll map it into a corresponding table with the corresponding columns based on whatever field you defined in that class. Okay, so basically TypeORM entities gives us a way to actually map an actual TypeScript class to an actual SQL table. All right, and additionally, TypeORM has a bunch of APIs that allows us to interact with that database table, so we don't ever have to worry about writing actual SQL statements at all. Okay, so what we'll do is this. We'll go ahead and create a new entity. And remember, the entity, all it does is it just represents a database table. It maps to a database table. So let's say we're creating an application that requires users to sign up. So you would want to create something like a user entity because that makes the most sense. Okay. And again, if you're using other frameworks like, Spring Boot, they have their own ways of handling entities, right, or schemas, and they have their own object relational mappers. I think Spring Boot uses something like, I think JPA, I believe. I'm not too sure. I haven't used Spring Boot for a while. But feel free to correct me down below if you are a Spring Boot user. So let's go ahead and create a class, call it user. And the thing that we must do is use a decorator, which is just a function. and we must use the entity decorator. So I'm going to import that from TypeORM, and we're going to just provide a pair of parentheses after because it's just a function. And you could pass in options if you want to, entity options. I typically like to specify the name and set the name to users because by default, TypeORM will create the table exactly as how you named the class. So since we have plural, obviously there's multiple users. I like to have my table pluralized, if that's even a word. So it just basically means that, there's multiple users, right? I don't like having it as just user, but that's personal preference. Anyways, so we're going to go ahead and define a couple of properties. Now, typically, your SQL tables usually will have a primary key. So we're going to go ahead and use the primary generated column decorator. And this will basically indicate that the field that we are defining is going to be a numeric value that auto increments, and it's auto generated. Okay, so this is equivalent to the primary key for a SQL table. We'll define a couple more properties. So, for example, I'll define a username property. Okay, and in order for this property to actually map to a column in the SQL table, we need to annotate it with the column decorator, like this. Okay, so this marks it as a table column. We'll go ahead and define, let's do password, because password is a common field, and we'll mark it as a column with the column decorator. And we'll do one more. Let's do something like created at, and this will be a data type. Okay, so this is how we can create a very simple entity. It's literally just a class. Okay, we define each of our properties that represents our user, and each property, if we want it to map to a column in the table, we must use the corresponding annotation. Okay, now if you wanted a certain field to be unique, you could just pass in options in the column, and you can set the unique property, and the value you can set it to true if you want to. If you wanted a column to be nullable, right, let's say for example, if you want a specific, let's say for example you wanted a certain field in the user table to be nullable. So let's go ahead and define something like I don't know, auth strategy, right? Maybe they want to use Google, Discord, whatever, right? So this could be like a string, right? And you could set this column to be nullable, which means that that value could be null. So if you were to create a new user, you would not be required to pass a value for auth strategy. Okay, whereas if you did not set it as nullable, it would throw an error saying that it doesn't have a default value. If you want to set default values, you could, right? So for example, for the created at, I can go ahead and set the default value to be new date. So whatever the current date is, okay? So those are the basics when it comes to, working with columns in your entity. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. So let's take this entity, and in order for us to actually register this entity, so that TypeORM will actually synchronize the entity and map it to a SQL table, we need to pass that entity class as a value inside this array. So I'm going to go ahead and pass user. So that's going to be imported from TypeORM/entity/user, just like that. And then now you're going to go ahead and see that, let's see, we have an error. Let's see what's going on. I think we have a problem with auth strategy. I think it's, let me see. I think it's complaining about the, yeah, I think it's complaining about the date. Let me do this actually. Let me actually do this. Let me do this. I'll leave that alone for now. And let me just restart the app. I'm not sure why that's throwing an error though. It's really weird. But I think it just doesn't recognize the JavaScript date object similar to the SQL one. That's my guess. So it might be a better idea to use like a numeric value if you want. Like so use like the timestamp instead of the actual date object. But it's okay. We'll leave it like that for now. But again, that's how you could set default values. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll go into my database or I'll go into the shell right now, and I'll type show tables, and you'll see that we have a table, and I'm going to describe this user's table, and you'll look at the schema, and you can see that it's pretty much identical. I mean, it's the same thing. You have ID, type is int, it is a primary key. You can see it right over here, auto increment, default null, okay, username, varchar 255. Another thing that you could do is you could set the type. So let's say, for example, right, like we know that in SQL there's many different data types. One of the data types for integers are big int. So let's say if I wanted this column to be a big int, because right now if you look at our table, the ID is actually, whoops, describe users. The ID is actually an integer rather than a big int. So maybe we might want to make it a big int to support larger values, right? So I can set the type by passing the type property and set it to big int. And when I save, and if I were to describe the table again, you'll see that it is now a big int. Okay, so that's pretty cool. All right, so now that we've created our user entity, let's go ahead and actually do something with this. Let's actually insert users into the database. So what we're going to do is we're first going to create a module for users. So I'll go ahead and use the nest CLI. So I'll type nest.g module users. So I'll generate a module, and then what I'll do is I'll generate a controller for that module. So /users/controllers/users/controller. So this will create a subfolder called controllers inside the users folder, because when we generated the module, it created that users folder for us. Okay, and so I'll do that, and then it'll also additionally create a users subfolder inside the controller subfolder right over here, as you can see right over here. Okay, so now that we have our controller, let's also create a service class. And if you're a little bit confused with what I'm doing, definitely check out my NestJS crash course video. It'll definitely help a lot and clear up all the things that I'm doing, okay? But I'm assuming that you all already know the basics of Nest. So I'm going to go and you also know, like, you know, what controllers, what services are, etc., etc. So I'm just going to go ahead and just assume that you all know that, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and just create a service now. So we'll provide the path, the relative path. So this will go inside the users subfolder, services, and then /users. So inside users, it'll create the services folder, which will create the users folder for us. Okay, and everything is going to be automatically imported and configured because we're using the CLI tool. So it automatically imports users controller and then adds that to the controls array. Likewise, for the user service, it'll add that to the providers array. So everything's good to go. Okay, so what we're going to need to do is we're first going to need to create a route inside our users controller. So what we'll do is we'll define two routes, one for a get request to get users and one for a post request to actually post users. Because right now our database is empty, we don't have any data. So let's first use the get decorator and we'll name our function get users. And this controller function will need to call a method in our service class, which we will have to define. But let's just set up the routes real quick. Okay. Okay. So now that we have our routes, let's just go into our logs real quick. Let's make sure that those routes are mapped so that we don't have any issues. So you can see that it mapped /users get and then it mapped /users post. So that's great. Both of those routes are working. All right. So now we're going to go into the users class. And what we're going to do is we're going to need to define the methods that the user controller will need to invoke. So in our case, for get users, it's going to go ahead and call a method that will get all the users. So let's create that method. I'll call this fetch users. Okay, or you can call it find users, whatever you want. It's up to you. Okay, and then we'll create one method called create user. Okay, and basically the service class is responsible for all of the business logic. So what I mean by that is anything that has to do with creating users, calling an external API, anything that has to do with that those typically should belong in the service layer. Okay, you don't want to put everything inside the user's controller, because the controller is typically used for handling incoming requests and sending outbound responses. And usually things that you would do in a controller would be things such as, extracting query parameters, validating a request body, using condition statements to check certain parameters the user sent, things like that. You don't want to, call a database directly from the controller. That's what the service class is for. Okay, so we have our two methods. Okay, and now what we need to do is we need to actually interact with the database. Okay, so first I'll show you how we can actually create a user, and then we're gonna go ahead and find the user. So how do we actually interact with the database? Okay, well, what we need to do is we need to inject the TypeORM repository into our class. Okay, so basically that is a dependency that we'll need to inject into the class or wherever we'll need it, right? And to do that, we're going to go ahead and implement the constructor. And then we're going to use the inject repository decorator. Okay, and then we need to specify what entity we want. And so in our case, it's going to be the user entity. So we'll pass in the user entity right over there. And then after that, we're just going to use the private keyword, give our value a name. So I'll just call this user repository, or our argument a name. And then to type annotate this, you would type annotate it with the repository, which comes from TypeORM. And I think this is a generic type. It's a class. And then it's a generic type, and you want to pass in the entity like that. Okay? So this is how you inject a repository. Now, you're going to notice that we're going to have an issue, and it says that Nest cannot resolve dependencies, and that's fine. And the reason why is because we're using TypeORM in a module that does not have that TypeORM module imported. So we need to go into our users module, and then we're going to add an import statement or import property inside the module metadata object like this. And then you're going to go ahead and import TypeORM module from @nestjs/TypeORM. And then you're going to reference TypeORM module. You're going to call the for feature method. And this takes an array of the entities that you want to use in the module. In our case, we're using user. So I'll pass in the user entity like that. And now if you save, the error is going to go away. So now we can actually use the user repository inside our user service. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. So I'm going to go inside create user, and we will need to take in some arguments. So we will need to create a data transfer object and an additional type to type annotate the parameter. Okay, but let me go ahead and do that first. So I'll create a new folder called DTOs. And then I'll create a new file called createuser.dto.ts. And we'll go ahead and create that DTO. And I'm only gonna go ahead and use the fields that we defined for our entity. So it's gonna be very similar. So we're going to need username, password, and just username and password really, because auth strategy, it's nullable, so we'll leave that alone. I really only just added that just to show you an example. And the ID is a primary key, and that's auto-generated. Okay, and created that will have a default value, so don't worry. That isn't going to be a value that's passed from the front end or whatever, or whichever user is sending a request to the server. So we're only going to have username and then password. And of course, you can use class validator to validate this DTO, the request body, but I'm not going to do that for this video. But if you want to learn how to do that, check out my NestJS crash course. The link will be in the description. Okay, so let's take this DTO and let's go ahead and do this. Let's go into the controller. We're going to use it. So inside the create user method, because this is the route handler for creating users, right? We're going to use the body decorator, and then I'm going to name the argument create user DTO, and then we'll type annotate it with create user DTO. Okay. And then what we're going to do is, well, first we need to actually inject our user service into the controller. So that's how we can actually use it to call the methods, right? So we'll implement the constructor, and then we will go ahead and set private user service, type annotated as user service or users service. Again, this will use dependency injection to inject the user service into our application. So now I can just simply do this.user service. I can reference the user service, and then I can call create user. Okay, but create user needs to take in parameters. So we will go ahead and create a custom type, or let me call this folder utils, and then inside that folder I'll create a file called types.ts, and I'll create a custom type called create user params, and then we'll set the username to string, password to string. The reason why you would do this, so the reason why you would create a separate type outside of like the DTO, and the reason why you would not want to reuse the DTO is because sometimes the user might send like an additional additional properties that you would need on the server, but that you would not save on the database, right? So for example, if you're building a login or if you're building like a registration form, you would typically have like two password fields, right? One is for the password, and the other one is to confirm the password. You wouldn't pass in both of those values into the service typically, right? Typically you would check those passwords if they matched using something like a validation pipe or like a middleware. But in our case, you wouldn't pass in confirm password and password into the service, because the service is really only going to take the password and save it to the database. So that's why I think it's a good idea to create different types that represent the actual finalized data that you're going to save to the database. And I think it's just good practice too. Okay, so let's go into our services. Let's go into user service, and we're going to name this argument for create user. We'll call this create user details, and then the type annotation, the type for this will be create user params. Okay, actually I'll just name this user details. Okay, and so what's going to happen is you're going to go ahead and create the user, or you're going to create the user based on the user details that are passed in. So what we're going to do is we're first going to declare a variable, call it new user, and then we're going to reference the user repository. So I'll go ahead and reference this.user repository. And then there's a lot of methods that we can call. The one that we need is the create method. And then this is where we're going to pass in all the details that we need for our user. So you notice that there is IntelliSense, so if I type U, username will pop up, right? But because we have type inference and we know that we're going to be passing in the correct data type, right, username and password, I can just simply I can use a spread operator, so that way it will unpack the username and password property inside here. And then additionally, I can go ahead and set the created at type to be a new date, like this, and save. Okay, but we're not done yet, because all this does is it just creates a user instance. We need to actually save it to the database, and the way that we can do that is by calling this dot user repository dot save new user, like this. And the save is an asynchronous it's an asynchronous method, so it returns a promise. So we can just return this call, and then we'll await it when we call it from the controller. This.user repository.create, the create method is not asynchronous, so you don't have to await it. Okay, cool. So this is going to create a user. So now let's go ahead and just pass in that create user DTO. Okay, and like I said, just for the sake of demonstration, right, I'll just do a confirm password field over here, right? And you'll see that let me do this real quick. Confirm password, right? And ideally what you could do is you could just take out the confirm password. So you could do something like user details, confirm password, right? You could take that out from the object, and all the other properties would be spread to user details. You could pass it in like that. So that's the reason why I suggest creating the actual DTO and then creating a separate type for the finalized version that is going to be saved to the database. The finalized schema that will be saved to the database. Okay, but you don't have to do this though. Okay, so I'm just go ahead and remove this. All right, so let's actually test this out. So let's go ahead and actually go into Postman. So I'm going to use Postman to do this. So let's go ahead and test out our post request endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and use Postman. You can use whatever HTTP client you want. It's up to you. I personally like using Postman, but you can use curl if you want to, or invoke REST method if you're using PowerShell. So we're going to make a post request to HTTP localhost, and the port for our application is port 3000. And the endpoint is just /users. Okay, and it's a post request. So let's go ahead and send some data. So we'll send username and password. So password. Hit send. It's going to give us a 201. Logs are not logging any errors, so that means nothing. That means no errors happen. Let's look at our table. So let's go ahead and do select asterisk from. So that's select all columns from the users table. And you'll see that we have our data. So we have passwords 123, auth strategy is null, username Anson, created at, and this is the time. And then the ID was auto-generated, which is good. So that's how we can create records in the database. So let's go ahead and fetch records. Okay, so we're going to go inside the user service class. We're going to go to our find users method. And all we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and search the database. And the way we do that in TypeORM is we reference the repository, so this.user repository. And we can just call find. And this will literally just get all of the user records, okay, from the users table. Now you can also pass in options too if you want to do filtering, but we're not going to do that. And so this will literally return an array of users. And this is also an asynchronous method call. So I'll just return this. And then what I'll do is when I call that method, I will go ahead and await that call. So before I continue, I actually let me actually continue with this first because I gotta fix something that I forgot to do. Because I realized in the create user method I didn't return anything, but I'll fix that in just a second. Let me just continue with the find users. So I'm gonna go ahead and add the async keyword in front of get users because we're going to use async await. So we're gonna go ahead and do const users equals await this dot user service dot find users returned users, just like this. Okay. Cool. You could also, if you're not really doing anything else, like if you don't need a request or response object, you could actually just do return this dot user service dot find users, and NestJS would take care of serializing the data for you back to the user. So watch this. So if I go ahead and use a get request, it's going to send me back the user. Okay, let's create another user. Okay, and let's make a get request, and we have 2 users now. Okay, and let me also do one more thing because I forgot to do this. Let me go ahead and just return this call. Okay, and then so whenever I make a post request to our API, it's going to return the user that was created. Now, obviously, in a real application, you would not return the password. But again, this is just a tutorial, so don't worry about that. And you would also encrypt, or not encrypt, you would also hash the password too in a real application before saving it to a database. So I just want to call that out just so that you all are aware of that. And I don't want you creating applications where you don't hash the password because that's not good. All right, so now that you know how to get data and create data in our database using our API, as well as using the repository API as well. Now let's go ahead and create 2 more endpoints, one for updating data in the database and one for deleting data that's in the database. So we'll start with updating data first. So you typically would use the put method, the put HTTP method for updating data. And this is going to require us to actually specify a route parameter because we need to make sure we know which user to actually update. So I'll go ahead and use a route parameter and I'll call it ID. And for the method name, I'll just call this update user by ID. Okay. And then we need to extract that route parameter by using the param decorator. So we'll pass an ID. And then what we want to do is we want to give our argument a name, and then the data type to be a number. So it is supposed to be a number. And additionally, what else we'll do is we'll use the parse int pipe, so that way it'll make sure that the route parameter is in fact a number. And if it isn't a number, it will just give an error back to the user. Okay, so this will actually validate the route parameter. Okay, so watch this. If I go into Postman, and if I were to make a pull request to the /users/ID endpoint, so I'll pass in 3 for the ID, or actually I'll pass in an invalid value. It's going to give me a 400 status code, validation failed. But if I pass in a number, it'll work. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and call our user service. We're going to create another method called update user. Okay, and update user will need to actually take in the values that we want to update. So in our case, we'll actually need a request body as well. So let's go ahead and create a DTO for that. So let's do update user.dto.ts. And we'll go ahead and just copy this, paste this here. And it's literally just going to be the same exact thing, honestly. Update user DTO, save that. And then we will go ahead and use the body decorator. And then we'll call the parameter update user DTO. Type annotated with the update user DTO class, just like this. Okay. And now we just need to pass in this DTO into the update user. But again, we can do the same thing that we did where we created a type. And I'll just do that just to be consistent. Okay, and these are really the only 2 properties the user can update. I mean, the user shouldn't be able to update their username in some applications, but in a lot of applications you can let them. So it's really up to how you want to implement that. Okay, so let's go into the service class, because we still need to implement the update user method and then have it take in the argument for update user params. So we'll go into our users.service.ts file. We'll implement the method update user, and then it's going to take in update user details, and then we'll type annotate this with update user params. Okay, and now let's go back to our controller. Let's just pass in, we'll just pass in the request body or the update user detail body here. We're just going to assume that the data is valid. Okay, you still have to make sure you do validation as well. Okay, so we need to do 2 things. We need to pass in the DTO as well as the ID, because we need to make sure we know what user is being updated. We can't just pass in the payload, like the request body, without knowing which user we're updating. So we're going to take in an additional parameter, which is the ID. So we'll have to pass in the ID first, and then the DTO. Okay? Sorry, we're going a little bit backwards, but hopefully you understand why we need the ID, right? Because what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and reference the user repository, and we're going to go ahead and call update, and we need to update based on criteria. So in our case, we're going to search for, we're not going to search, but we're going to update if the user matches the ID that we're passing in. Okay, so that's going to be for that first parameter. The second parameter is what we want to actually update. So we want to update username, password, etc., etc. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this. So what I'll do is I'll spread the update user details like this. Okay, so if the user wants to update the username, that means username will only be updated. If they include both username and password, then both of those will be updated. If they only include password, then only password will be updated. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and await this. Actually, I'll just return this call because it doesn't really matter. We don't, because this returns an update result, and we don't really need anything to do with that. Okay, and I'll just leave this call alone. So I'll just async await this because I don't want to return the update result response. I'll just leave it alone. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a pull request now. So I think we only have 3 users, right? If I look into my PowerShell, I only have 3 users. So let's update the user with ID number 3 first. So we'll go over to our Postman. we're making a pull request to our /users/3 endpoint, and the 3 is the route parameter, remember that. And we're going to update the username, so I'll just call this Anson1. Password, I'll just call this 00001211. Okay, so we get a 200. Okay, let's query our database. And it updated, perfect. So for ID number 3, it updated the username and the password. If I omit the password and if I just want to update the username, it would only update the username. Okay, it doesn't update the password. If I want to update only the password, right, it will only update the password. Okay? And obviously it makes sense because we are omitting those values. So those values are not even going to be in the object itself. So it wouldn't even replace those values when we update it because we're using the spreader operator right over here. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. One thing that I will quickly mention is that I think instead of put, I think patch would be better in this case because patch actually allows, typically you would use patch if you want to update a partial, like if you want to do a partial update of the entity. Put typically is for like modifying the entire resource. So if you want to update the whole entire resource, you would use put. But patch is usually for just, updating like a portion of the entire record. So in our example, we would only update the password. So it would make sense to use patch, but we'll just leave it like this for now. Okay? Because the whole point is you understanding the idea behind these different methods. So let's go ahead and implement now a delete method. So we just use the delete decorator. That is going to be imported up top over here. Okay? And we can do the same thing. We can go ahead and delete by ID. So I'll literally just copy and paste this whole method, and I'll just rename this delete user by ID. And we're just going to remove this body decorator because we don't need that. We really only need the request. We really only need the user ID. Sorry, I can't speak today. We only need the user ID. So we're going to go ahead and implement a method called delete user, which is going to take in an ID as a parameter. So inside users service, we'll go ahead and implement that method right now. Okay. And then what we'll do is we'll just return this dot user repository, and we're going to call delete, and we can pass in the criteria. So we'll just pass in the ID just like that. Obviously, if the record does not exist, it will not do anything. But if it does, it'll delete it. Okay, so let's go ahead and save. And let's change the method to delete from put. So now we're using a delete request. And I'm going to go ahead and delete user number 3. Seems like everything went well. No errors. Let's go ahead and select from users. You can see that user number 3 is gone. User of ID number 3 is gone. If I were to delete number 2, user with ID number 2 is gone. If I were to delete number 1, user of ID number 1 is gone. And that leaves us with an empty set for our users table. Okay, so that's pretty much how you can delete records from the database. Now, obviously, it would be a lot more complicated when you have relations like one-to-one relations or one-to-many relations. So it's a little bit more complex when you do it like that. But I just figured I'd mention that in case you did need to do one-to-one relationships. All right, so we're going to move on to more complex topics now. So we're going to go ahead and move on to relationships with TypeORM entities, which is very similar to relationships in SQL. We're going to talk about one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one relationships. So if you're already familiar with SQL, you'll know what I'm going to be talking about, but I will briefly explain it to those who are not so familiar or fairly new to SQL. So a one-to-one relationship is basically just where you have one record in one table that is associated with literally only one other record in another table. So here's a real life example, right? Let's say you have a user that is registered to your application. The user can have a one-to-one relationship with a profile, okay? Because every user can only have one profile. Now, it also depends on how you design your application, how you decide to, architect everything, because every application is different. Okay, but it just depends on how you want to implement it, right? So if we say a user has only one profile, that just means that there is one user in the users table that is associated with only one profile that is in another table called the profile table, right? Another example that I could give you is, let's say, for example, if you're building an application where a user or an employee can only have one job, right? That would be a one-to-one relationship under, specific limitations, right? In the real world, obviously, people can have multiple jobs, so that would really be more so like a one-to-many relationship, right? Same thing with the user profile. Like, some applications allow you to have multiple profiles, so that would be like a one-to-many relationship as well. But of course, it just depends on the constraints and the parameters that you set for your application. One more additional thing that I will mention is that when you're using SQL, it is very important that you follow normalization. So if you're familiar with object-oriented programming, you typically want to encapsulate properties into objects or classes as much as you can. So if there is a set of properties that you have defined in the table that could actually belong in another table, and you can create a relationship between those two tables, you should most definitely do so. So an example would be, let's say, for example, if you have a users table, you could obviously put every single piece of information you want in that table. You can add the username, the email, the password, the JWT token. You can add access tokens, all that kind of stuff, right? But you want to try to normalize things as much as possible, because that's usually one of the rules with SQL. I mean, you don't have to, but it does optimize your database a lot more better, okay? And it makes it a lot more faster, okay? So you want to try to get into the practice and habit of creating tables and then having those tables relate with each other one way or the other, whether it's a one-to-one, a one-to-many, or a many-to-one. Okay, but let's just go ahead and use a simple example with a one-to-one relationship. So in our application, we'll just make it so that every single user can only have one profile. Okay, so we'll create an entity called profile. Okay, we'll use the entity decorator, and I'll set the name to profiles, or you can call it user profiles, whatever you want, if you want to be more specific. This profile will have its own primary key, so we'll use the primary generated column decorator. Okay, and what we'll do is we will have more data for this profile. So for example, we'll have a first name, last name, right? Column. It's, and of course you get add other stuff too. Let's add an age property as well. Let's add date of birth. We'll leave it like this for now. Okay, so this could be the user's profile. All right. So how do we set up the one-to-one relationship? Okay. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to go inside the user entity first, and then we're going to use the one-to-one decorator, and we're going to pass in a callback function, and this callback function is supposed to return the entity that it has a one-to-one relationship with. So we're going to pass in the profile entity like that, and it's going to be imported from the profile file over there. And then underneath, what we want to do is we want to use the join column decorator as well. And then we'll go ahead and set the type. We'll define the property as profile, and the type will be profile. Okay. So once we do this, we need to then go into profile, and we actually don't even need to do anything in here because it's just a one-to-one relationship from user to profile. Okay, so we don't need to do anything inside the profile class. Okay, so now the only thing that we'll need to do is we'll need to figure out a way how to actually populate the profile, right? Because it's not actually required. You don't actually need to populate the profile. So let me just show you real quick. So let me see. Oh yeah, one more thing that we need to do is, of course, register our entity. So we have to go inside app.module.ts, inside the array, pass in profile like this. And that will be imported up top here. And that error will go away. Okay, so let's go ahead and just create a user again. So let's just do that. Okay, so that created a user for us, but we don't have a profile. Now, if you look in the database, you're going to see that what the join column actually does, like that decorator that we have right over here, what it does is it basically just joins that profile ID column. This is basically like you can think of this as like the other primary key that will allow us to know which profile belongs or relates to this user. Okay, so whatever value this is will basically be the primary key of the profile record. Okay, so let's go ahead and create an endpoint real quick that will take care of setting up user profiles. So inside the user's controller, and I mean, if you want to, you could create a separate controller. If you want to, you don't have to, but I'll just do it inside the user's controller. So we'll do post, and then what I'll do is this will be users profiles like that. And I think there should be no problem picking up this route, even though we have other routes. Yeah, there shouldn't be a problem because this route over here is just the base users route. So this will be for profiles, create user profile. Okay, and we're going to do the same exact thing that we did for create user when we make a post request. We're going to create a DTO. So I'll call this create user profile.dto.ts. And it's literally just going to be a class. And it's going to have all the properties that we had defined in the profile entity. So first name, last name, age, and date of birth. So we'll do first name, string, last name, string, age, number, date of birth, string. And again, we're assuming that everything is validated, but like I said, make sure you validate everything yourself in your actual application, okay? Create user profile DTO is what this should be called. Okay, so now I can take this and I can type annotate the argument. So we'll call this create user profile DTO. Type annotate it with the class, but that needs to be imported, and that'll be imported up top over here. Okay, and then all we'll need to do is we'll just need to go to our user service, implement that method, and then call that method to create the profile. Like I said, if you want to, you can create a profile service as well as a profile controller, but I'm not going to do that just to save a little bit of time. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a method called create user profile. Okay, and of course, we're going to create a custom type to represent the user profile details. So let's go into our types.ts file, create a type called create user profile params. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy everything here inside here, just like that. I'm going to copy the type name, and then we're going to go into the user service, and then we're going to pass in an argument, or we're going to label the parameter. So we're going to call this create user profile details. And then we're going to import that type that we just created. So that'll be import up top here. Okay. So in order to make sure we attach the profile on the correct user, we'll obviously need the user's ID. So what I'll do is inside user controller, we're going to make this route a little bit more explicit. So we're going to define this route as :ID/profiles create. So the ID will be the user's ID, and then the profiles will be the endpoint. Okay, and so we'll need to obviously retrieve that parameter. So I'll do that. So at param ID number like this, and I'll use the parse int type as well. Now in a real application, you'll typically have authentication, so you could just get the user ID from the request.user object. Okay, that's usually where the user is stored if you're assuming you're using Passport and Express Session. Okay, so you don't need to actually pass in the ID of the user in the route. Okay, you just grab that from the session. Okay, in our case, since we're not using sessions, we have to do it this way, but it's fine. Okay, so user service will also take in the ID of the user. Okay, and what we need to do is we need to go ahead And first, we need to search for the user inside create user profile. So const, okay, user equals await this dot user repository, find one, and we're going to use find one by because it's going to allow us to use conditions. So we want to search where the ID matches the ID that we pass into this function. And let's just add the async keyword in front of this method. And we're going to go ahead and say if there's no user, we'll throw a new HTTP exception, and I'll say user not found, cannot create profile. And then the status code, I'll use the HTTP status enum, which is imported up top over here from NestJS common, and I'll just do bad request like that. Okay. If the user does exist, then we'll create the profile, and then we'll need to update the user as well. So first thing we'll do is we'll create the profile, but in order to create the profile, we need the actual repository. So we need to do two things. One, we need to go into the users module and we need to import the profile entity and then put that inside the array. Otherwise, it's going to give us that error that we got earlier when it complained about the user repository not being a proper dependency. So we need to add profile inside here because we're using the entity inside the user module in the user service. Next, I'm going to copy this inject repository. I'm going to paste that, and I'm just going to replace user with profile down here. And I'm going to rename user repository to profile repository. And then we're going to change this to profile. Okay? It's just really the same thing. Everything's repetitive. And then now what I'll do is I'll do const new profile equals this dot profile repository create. And then what we want to do is we want to pass in the values. Okay? So in our case, we just need let's see, first name, last name, yeah. So I'll just go ahead and just pass in create user profile details like that, because we know that all the properties here are going to match exactly here. Okay, again, we're assuming that we've already validated everything already. Okay, and if you have not validated in your application, please make sure you do validate your data. So create is not an asynchronous method, so we don't need to await this. But we do need to save the profile to the database. So I'll go ahead and do const save profile equals await this dot profile repository dot save new profile. Next, what I want to do is we know that at this point in our logic, we know that the user is already in fact defined, right? So what I want to do is I want to update the user. So I'll do user.profile equals saved profile. And then I'll go ahead and return this .user repository .save, and then we want to save the user. Okay, because we're updating it. Okay, so this will return the user entity. So let's go ahead and call this method. So I'll just do return this create user profile, pass in the ID, and then we'll pass in the DTO. This is the same exact thing. So let's go ahead and try to create. Well, first I think we need to create a user because I think I deleted all my users. I think, yeah. And yeah, so let's create a user first. So let's first create a user. So this user has an ID of 5. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll make a request to /users/5/profiles, a post request. Okay, so this is going to make a post request, and then we want to pass in the correct request payload. So first name, let's do Anson. Last name, the developer. Age 24. You'll be we'll just do 01/01/1997. Okay, that's not my actual birthday, but I'll just leave it like that. I'm gonna click send, and it gives us a 500 status code. Let's see what's going on. I think we may have accidentally. Did I call the wrong method? Oh, whoops! I called the wrong method. I called this .create user profile. It's supposed to be. Whoops! Sorry about that. It's supposed to be this .user service .create user profile. Excuse me. There we go. Let's do this again. Perfect. Now it works. So you can see now we now have a relationship between users and our profile. This is a one-to-one relationship. And now if I query my database, if I were to select from users, you'll see that now before the profile ID was null, but now the profile ID is 2. And 2 is actually the primary key of the profile in the profiles table. So if I select from user underscore profiles, you can see that the primary key for this profile is number 2. So if you want to actually get the correct profile for the user, you need to first get the actual profile ID, which is the primary key. You can take that and then query the user profiles table by the ID, and that's how you get the profile. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So yeah, that's how you can create one-to-one relationships, and you can do this literally with any single entity you want. Okay, so that's pretty much it when it comes to one-to-one relationships. All it really is it just means that one entity or one record in the table has exactly one association with another record in another table. Okay, that's really all it is. All right, so now that we've actually created a one-to-one relationship, what about if we were to query the data, right? Let's say, for example, if I go to, if I make a GET request, let me actually open a new tab, and let's just go ahead and grab all the users, right? You'll notice that right now, it only gives me the user, but it doesn't give me the profile, right? Now, the reason why this happens is because by default, it's not going to give you all of the relations. You'll have to actually, you'll actually need to pass in options for that to happen. So I'll show you how to actually get the relations. So we're going to go into the service, because that's where we're calling the repository. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to pass in options, and you're going to want to pass in this relations property. And this is an array, and you're basically just going to pass in the exact property name for that relation. So in our case, user, the property name is profile, so that's what I'm going to pass in. Okay, and it's an array because you can have multiple relations for a single entity. So I'm going to go ahead and save, and now when I click on send, it's going to give me the users, and it's going to give me the profile. If it exists, that is. Okay, if it doesn't, then it won't give it to us. Okay, if I want to create another, let me create another user. So I'll create another post request. So let's do this. Let's do JSON. Let's do username, Anson1, password, Anson1. Okay, so we have that, and if I go ahead and query all the users, you can see that for this user over here, it does not give me a profile, it just says null, and then for this one over here, it does. Okay, so if you were building a real application, and if the user did not have a profile set up, you would just check to see if that profile property is null, and if it's null, you could just tell the user on the front end, be like, hey, you have not set up your profile, click on this button to set up this profile, have them fill out a form with all of the required information, make a post request, and then you're done. Okay, so I'm just giving you an example of how something like that would work in a real application. But hopefully this makes sense. Alright, so now that you know about one-to-one relationships, let's go ahead and move on to one-to-many relationships. And I think this example would be a lot easier because we can think of so many one-to-many relationships in the real world, right? For example, a single person, right, can have many cars. So the relationship between the person and the car is a one-to-many relationship because a person can have many cars, right? Same thing with a person can have many houses, a person can have many credit cards, right? These are good examples of one-to-many relationships, right? So I'll show you a simple example where our user is going to have a one-to-many relationship with their posts, right? Because if you're building some kind of social media platform, or some kind of blogging application, right? Your users are going to have posts, okay? So what we'll do is this. We'll create a new entity called posts, and it's just going to be a really simple entity. So let me just use the entity decorator. Okay, and let me actually just prefix this with user underscore posts. And then let's just export this class. So this will be called posts. I'll call it post. Okay, it's of course going to have a primary key, which we use the primary generated column decorator. We're going to go ahead and give the post a title property. So title, whoops, I don't know what's going on with my keyboard. Title string, and we'll also just add a description string as well. We'll just make it really simple. Okay, so now we need to set up a one-to-many relationship between the user and the post, and then we need to set up a many-to-one relationship from the post to the user. Let me also just rename this from posts to post. Okay, so let's go into our user entity, and right underneath our one-to-one relationship, we'll set up a one-to-many relationship. So to do that, we're going to use the one-to-many decorator, and then we're going to pass in a callback function. And for this one, it's just going to be one-to-many, and then the type that we want to pass is going to be the actual post itself. Okay, so, or not the post entity. Like, wait, whoops, not the TypeORM, not the NestJS decorator. I accidentally imported that. It's supposed to be the post entity like this. This post entity, which is imported from here. Okay, and then we need to pass in a second argument, which is for the inverse side. So for the inverse side, it's going to be a post, and then we're going to reference post dot, and now we have not defined that property yet, but we're going to have to define a user property on the post entity after. Okay, but over here, the property that we'll define here is just going to be posts, and they'll just be an array of post like that, an array of the post entity. Now we got to revisit the post entity, and we have to basically do the same thing, but this time instead of one-to-many, it's many-to-one. So many-to-one. So it's going to take in a callback function, okay, and this time it's just going to take the user entity, so let's import that, and then from here, the second callback function, it takes in the user argument, and then we want to map it to the posts property that we defined just now in the user's entity. And then over here, the property that we'll define here is just going to be whatever we had right over here, post.user. So user. Okay, and now you can see that it works. Okay, no more errors. We have successfully defined our one-to-many and many-to-one relationship between the user and the post, right? Because it makes sense the user can have many posts, but those posts are always going to belong to one user. Now, it's a different story if that post can have different, collaborators, but typically there's always going to be one single owner of that post, okay? So we'll go ahead and leave it like this, okay? Now, let's just go ahead into our users module. Let's go ahead and import that post entity, so that way we can actually use the post repository. And I think honestly the best thing that we should have done was definitely use we should have used multiple controllers, but it's okay. I just want to make things as simple as possible so you all don't get confused. But what we'll do is we'll create another post request, or we'll define another post request endpoint. And for this one, it'll just be similar to our profiles, okay? But instead it'll just be :id posts. Okay, so the ID is just the user ID, and then post is the endpoint where they will create the post. So we'll do create user post. Okay, and you can imagine that we'll need to do the same thing where we grab the route parameter ID, and then we'll also need to create a DTO for the post. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. We're going to go into DTOs. We'll create a DTO called create user post.dtl.ts. We'll create a class, create user post DTO, and it only needs the title and description. I think we only defined 3 properties, right? Title, description, yep, that's fine. And I'll also create the type, so I don't have to worry about that later. So export type, create user post params, title string, description string, same exact thing. Okay, but this will be used for type annotating the services parameter. Okay, so now let's go back to our controller, and we're going to go ahead and use the body decorator. We're going to name our arguments create user post DTO, and we'll type annotate it with create user post DTO, like that. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and call this dot user service dot create user post, and then we'll need to, of course, pass in the ID as well as the user post DTO data. So we need to implement that service now, or implement that service method. So let's go into services, users, user service. Down here, I'll implement the method create user post right over there. Yep, perfect. So it just needs to take in two parameters, the ID, which is a number, and then create user post details. And the type for that will be create user post params. Okay. And then now all we'll need to do is we'll need to create a post, save it, and then attach that post to the user so that post belongs to that user. So I'll show you how to do that. So we already imported the post entity, and then we placed it inside the array for the forFeature argument. So we're good. So now we can just import the post repository without any issues. So let's import the post entity. So that's going to import that up top here. Rename this to post repository, and then change this generic over here to post, like that. So now I can use the post repository to create post. So let's do this. Const new post equals this dot post repository dot create, and we'll just pass in create user post details, like that. Okay, we'll save the post. So const saved post equals await this dot post repository dot save new post. Let's also add the async keyword in front of our create user post method. Oh yeah, also I forgot, we should also search for the user too. So let me just copy what we had up top over here, create user profile, and just paste this here. We should have also defined a method called find user by ID, but it's okay. So that way we could have just reused that over and over again instead of just manually doing this. But we'll leave it like this for now. So we find the user. If the user is not found, we'll throw an error. So now the only thing that we'll need to do next is we'll need to, of course, ensure that the post is saved and related to the user. So instead of actually just only passing create user post details, what we can do is we can actually pass in an object, destructure create user post details. So this will give you all of the parameters, like, you know, the title and description. And we also need to pass in the user object like this. So this will ensure that it relates to that user. Okay, so when we save the post, we can actually just, instead of just doing this, we can just return. So this will return back to the controller, which will return as a response to the user. So let's try this out. So let's go into our console. Let's make sure there's no errors. Let's see. Entity metadata for user post not found. I think we forgot to import it in user modules, I think. Or wait, app module. Yep, let's do that real quick. Save. There we go. All right, so let's just describe tables, or show tables, sorry. And we have all three of our tables. Perfect. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go into Postman, and we're going to go and call the endpoint that we had just created for creating user post. So instead of ID/profiles, it's just going to be ID/posts. So /users/posts. Let me just also make sure that we have correct users. So we have a user of ID number 5. Okay, so that's only one user. Okay, that's fine. So we'll just work with number 5, ID of number 5. Okay, so let's pass in a request body. So title, hello world, description, I love programming. Let me also just move this on here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and make a post request to this endpoint, and you can see over here that we just created the post. Okay, And I'm not sure why. Yeah. So the post has the user relation, and this is the ID of the post. Perfect. Okay. So if we look in the database now, if I select from user posts, you're going to see that this user ID column has the value 5, and that's basically just the primary key of the user that this post belongs to. Okay, so if you were to query this in like a database, you would do something like select from. You would do something like you would do something like an inner join, or if you wanted to only filter out by a user by its ID, you would do something like select from user posts where user ID is equal to 5, and that would give you this post. Okay, and I can go ahead and create more and more posts. So let's just do that. Okay. And now, if I want to go ahead and fetch my users, you'll see that it's not going to give me my posts, and that's because we did not add that relation when we were finding the user, but we can easily do that. So if we go into the user service, and then we go into up top over here in the find users method, we can add a comma after profile and then specify posts like that, which is the exact field name in our TypeORM entity. So after we save, if I were to fetch for users again, you'll see that now, let me zoom out a little bit. You'll see that now it gives me the user, the profile, and the posts. Okay. Now in an actual application, you probably wouldn't want to actually include all these relations. You would actually want the user to visit the actual endpoint to get the actual profile. It's not a good idea to fetch all of these things because it will actually slow down the request a lot. Okay, but that is pretty much it with one-to-many and many-to-one relationships. So that will be pretty much it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. I really had a lot of fun teaching you all how to use TypeORM and MySQL with NestJS. I personally love using TypeORM and MySQL. I'm a huge fan of MySQL. I love relational databases, and it's my pleasure to teach you all something new, hopefully for most of you. But yeah, so thank you so much for watching. If you all love this video, definitely leave a like, leave a comment down below to show your support. Subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, leave a comment. If you need any help with code, you could also leave a comment, or the best thing to do is join my Discord server, where I have a lot of users where they can ask questions, and there's a lot of people who are willing to help. And that'll be it. So thank you so much for watching this video. My name is Anson, and I'll see you all in the next episode. Peace out.